Hello, welcome to Worldwide Church Planners Old Testament Survey 101. This is session 4. I am Jerry Clifton with Worldwide Church Planners. Today we will be reviewing some of what we ended up with in the last session, and we'll be moving on through Exodus and probably into Leviticus. So one of the things I wanted to do is, I know we made it to the Exodus in our last session, but I wanted us to go back and review some of the things that we talked about in the first part of the book of Exodus, and really just to make sure that you understand that the Exodus is basically the high point, the pinnacle, the climax of the Old Testament, of the redemption of God's people. And when we talk about redemption, we are talking about there are several different meanings, but when we talk about redemption, we are talking about a reclaiming of something, and God is reclaiming His people here from the nation of Egypt. Redeem also has the meaning of buying something, purchasing something, as Christ did, as He redeemed us from our sins. He bought our salvation through His blood. So the redemption of the nation of Israel in Exodus is the high point, and not only the redemption, not only the Passover, the people of in Exodus is the high point, but chapters 12 through 14 basically are the high point of the entire Old Testament. It talks about the Passover. It talks about the Pharaoh releasing the people, them going to the Red Sea, God bringing the people through the Red Sea by His power. And we also here, we talked about in the beginning of Genesis about the progressive revelation of God. And we're seeing more and more of that progressive revelation here. We see the power of God as He redeems His people through His power, through what He does with Pharaoh, the plague that He sends to Pharaoh, and redeeming His people through what He does with His power by holding back the waters of the Red Sea and bringing His people through the Red Sea. So I want us just to review what we did get to in the book of Exodus, and basically I want us to just look at it again, because this is so important. This part of the Bible is so important. It's foundational. It's just if you don't understand it, then there are many things in the rest of the Bible that you won't understand. So what we need to understand is that in Exodus, the people of Israel were in bondage for 400 years. They are now basically an infant nation. There are over 2 million of them in the nation of Egypt. And Egypt has basically served as a womb to birth the nation of Israel. Some people have called it an incubator for the nation, and an incubator is what people with eggs, chickens, put eggs in to hatch out. So Egypt has served as a womb and an incubator for the nation of Israel. They have now grown to a number of over 2 million. The people have cried out to God, and God has heard their cries, and things are set in motion. That's what God is going to do to deliver that nation from the hand of Pharaoh and from that nation of Egypt. So the Exodus narrates that liberation. It tells about the things that happened, with Moses, with Aaron, with Pharaoh, and with the nation of Egypt, as they leave that captivity and they go and they start the migration back to Canaan, back to the promised land, back to the land that God had told Abraham, that He promised Abraham that He was going to give him a land. And Moses, he being the great deliverer, he being basically the leader of the nation of Israel, Moses announces those 10 plagues to Pharaoh. And one of the promises that we always need to remember in that 10 plagues is God told Moses, I want you to tell him that Israel is my firstborn son. And I'm going to deliver my firstborn son from you, and I'm going to carry them back into the land. And God's promise definitely came true in the 10th plague that He the 10th judgment that he placed upon Egypt as Pharaoh's firstborn son was killed. The firstborn of the whole nation was killed. And of course we know through the Passover that the Israelites passed through that. The death angel passed over them because of the blood that God had told them to post on their door. So the first leg of their journey, as we see here in chapters 1 basically through 18, and 1 through 18 relate Israel's exodus from bondage in Egypt. And we talked about that in the last session. But we didn't get into chapters 19 to 40. And chapters 19 to 40 basically are God's instructions to Israel. And they're given by God on Mount Sinai to Moses for the life of the nation and how he wants worship to be carried out, how he wants daily life to be carried out. And of course we know that those laws, the basic laws that we know are the 10 Commandments, but there were many more laws that God gave Moses on Mount Sinai. We know that the Hebrew title, We'eleth Shemoth, and it begins with, these are the names, comes from the first phrase in Exodus 1:1, and we started out with the genealogy with the names in Exodus. So that shows, actually, in Exodus begins in the Hebrew with the word and so basically that ties Exodus to Genesis as a continuation of what God's doing in these beginning books of the Bible. Exodus means exit or go out, departure. It means leaving. So the key event, of course, in Exodus is that exit from the promised land. There's also a theme of redemption, as we said in Exodus, and we will be talking about that shortly. We know that the author of Exodus is Moses, and as we talked about the first 5 books, that authorship has been challenged, but those challenges have never stood, and actually many of them have been unproved. The date of Exodus, we probably think that the Exodus took place, as close as we can tell, between 1445 and 1405 BC. And Moses probably, what most scholars say, is that Moses kept an account of what was going on with him, with Pharaoh, with the nation of Israel, and things in Egypt as these things were going on. And Exodus covers the period from the arrival of Jacob in Egypt, as we talked about last time. When Jacob came down to Israel, he and Joseph were reunited, and it goes all the way to the erection of the tabernacle 431 years later and in the wilderness. So that would be the 1445 BC. That would be when they were in the wilderness. There are 2 basic themes in Exodus, both of them pretty much tied together. The first theme is redemption. And that redemption, of course, is portrayed in the Passover. As God redeems his people, he shows his power, who he is, by allowing his people to place the blood of the lamb on the doorpost of their homes so that their firstborn would not be killed. Their homes would be passed over. But the homes of the Egyptians didn't have that option. The homes of the Egyptians were visited by the death angel on that night, and their firstborn were killed. And it said even the firstborn of the cattle were killed. So God is very thorough in his judgment against the Egyptians. And there's also a theme here of deliverance, and basically in that chapters 12 through 14, which was accomplished, the deliverance that we see that was accomplished by after that Passover. Pharaoh wanted the people to go. He even told them to leave. Not only did Pharaoh want them to leave, the people of Egypt wanted them to leave. They said, not only are we allowing you to leave, we want you to leave. We want you to get out. Because we believe now that even if you don't get out, we will all be killed. And they saw what had happened and the progressive judgments that God had put on Egypt and how they got worse and they got worse until they got to the death of the firstborn. And was God going to stop there? The people were going to leave Egypt one way or another. So that's what the people of Egypt wanted to say. We want you to get out. We don't just ask you to get out. We don't give you permission to get out. We actually want you to get out. So Exodus portrays the birth of Israel as a nation, and which would bring God's rule on earth. So it records the story of Israel's redemption under the leadership of Moses, and it also serves as an account, as an expose of the falsehood of idolatry. Many of the things as we're going into Exodus will show the falsehood of idolatry. Yahweh is revealed as infinitely superior to any so-called God. Well, Pharaoh called on his magicians, on his sorcerers, and on his gods to replicate some of the things that Moses and Aaron did at the beginning of the plagues. But as the plagues went on, finally the sorcerers and the magicians told Pharaoh, this is something that we can't do. This is something that we can't replicate. This is actually God. And basically, God was challenging the gods of the nation of Israel. Of the nation of Egypt, showing his power, showing that he was and is superior to the gods of Egypt. And of course, we know he is God of all. So Exodus teaches that obedience to God is necessary for a redeemed and set apart people. The nation of Israel had to take the instruction that God gave them. Just start out with the Passover. They had to take that instruction. They had to do what God told them to do with the blood of the lamb. Place it over their doorpost and place it over their lintels, and do the things that God had told them about the animal that they had sacrificed, or what to do with the animal, that they were supposed to eat it, and they were not supposed to leave any of it until the morning. And if there were any left over in the morning, they were supposed to burn it all with fire. So they had to do what God told them to do. The key to Exodus is redemption that we just talked about. That's about the whole actually book of Exodus is about redemption, how God delivered them, how God redeemed the nation of Israel. He had providentially placed them there through the things that we talked about with Joseph, and how Joseph had gone down into Egypt. God had basically saved the nation of Egypt, but not only did he save the nation of Egypt, he saved the nation of Israel, because later on when his brothers came for grain, the famine was great in the land. And when his brothers came down for grain, he recognized who they was. They didn't at first recognize him, but he recognized them. And of course, we know that he held one of the brothers, sent the rest of them back for his younger brother Benjamin, and then finally the whole family was brought down. 70 of them was brought down. And that was the beginning that God placed them in a place where they could become a nation of themselves, where they could become basically in that womb of Egypt wind up to being over 2 million people. And of course, this was over a time span of 400 years. The people who were there at the beginning didn't see the Exodus, so this was over a time of 400 years, and that is some more of the progressive revelation of God. What God is going to do things not on our time schedule, but on his time schedule. And so we see his power, we see his might as he providentially placed Joseph there to build a nation. The nation was built to over 2 million people when they left, and how he brought them back out of the nation, how he redeemed them out of the nation, carried them back through the wilderness, carried them back even through their disobedience, carried the next generation that went into the wilderness, carried the next generation into the promised land. We'll talk a little more about that. The key verses of Exodus are Exodus 6:6, and this is what chapter 6, verse 6 says, "Therefore say to the children of Israel, I am the Lord." And that's what he wanted them to recognize. That's what he wants us to recognize, that he is the Lord. "I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rescue you from their bondage and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. His outstretched arm, he was talking about the power of God. He is more powerful than, he was telling them that he was more powerful than any of the gods of the Egyptians. That is not the gods of the Egyptians. He was going to show himself to be more powerful than the gods of the Egyptians, and with great judgments. And we know the 10 plagues that he placed upon Egypt, that after Egypt placed the nation of Israel in bondage, that they brought judgment upon themselves for doing that. And these are the judgments that God poured out upon the nation of Egypt for doing that, those 10 plagues that we talked about. And then in chapter 19, verses 5 and 6, he says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice, and that's key. That's key to our relationship with God. That was key to their relationship with God, and that's key to our relationship with God. If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant. Now that covenant is a word that we've used a little bit. We talked about the Noahic covenant. We talked about the Abrahamic covenant. There are several covenants that we go on and talk about. Let me see if I can find them here right quick that I was looking at. We talked about the Noahic covenant. We talked about the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, and this is what we're talking about right here. We will go on and talk about the Davidic covenant and, of course, the new covenant that God has with us, the New Testament. In the New Testament that God has with us. But this is what God is saying here. A covenant is a promise. A covenant is something that says, I will do something and you will do something. It's more than a promise. It's just an agreement that two come into. And basically when you go on and study in the book of Exodus, that's when Moses brought down the word from Mount Sinai, basically that's what they said. Whatever God says to do, we will do it. Now, of course, that goes on to prove not to be the case, not to be true, but that is the covenant. God says, I will do this if you will do this. And that's what he's saying in 19:5 and 6. If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. We just studied in Genesis, the creation of the earth. Who created it? God, of course. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That's in 19:5 and 6. So those verses are keys to the understanding of Exodus and keys to God's relationship and God's progressive revelation of himself through Scripture. And those three chapters, chapters 12, 13, and 14, are the key chapters, I will say, of Exodus, and maybe we could go ahead and even say they're the key chapters of the whole Old Testament, because all of the Old Testament basically is not built exactly on this, but it's the climax of the entire Old Testament. As I said, it is the pinnacle. It is the high point of the Old Testament. We see the salvation of Israel through the blood, and of course that points to the blood of Jesus Christ later on in the Passover. And through the power of the Red Sea, through God's power, he carried them through the Red Sea. Did they wind up at the Red Sea with no place to go by accident? Of course not. They were brought there. They were led there. And so the Exodus is the central event of the Old Testament, just as the cross is the central event of the New Testament. So there are many types, there's many shadows that we call, and a shadow is something that even though we don't see the object, we see the shadow of the object, and we know there's something more there that's causing the shadow. So we see types and shadows as we go through the Old Testament, which point to things in the New Testament. One of the types that's a great one to look at is the type of Joseph, as he was a type of Jesus Christ. He pointed to Jesus Christ. Many of the things in Joseph's life were parallel. Many of the things in Joseph's life pointed to or were the same as things in Jesus Christ's life. And here's a few of the things that I thought about that in Joseph's life that show him as a type of Jesus Christ, as the Passover is a type of the salvation of the Lord in the New Testament. Think about these things that Joseph was. First of all, he is the object of his father's special love. He had promises of divine exaltation. He was mocked by his family. He was sold for pieces of silver, the same Jesus Christ was. He was stripped of his robe. He was delivered up to the Gentiles. Joseph was delivered up to the Egyptians. He was falsely accused. He was faithful amid temptation. He was thrown into prison. He stood before rulers. His power was acknowledged by those in authority. He saved his rebellious brothers from death when they realized who he is. He is exalted after humiliation and through humiliation, just as Jesus was. He embraces God's purpose even though it brings him intense physical harm. He stays with the course. He stays with what God has called him to do, just as Jesus did. He welcomes Gentiles into his part of a family. Joseph married a Gentile in Egypt. He gives hungry people bread. Hallelujah. He gives hungry people bread. People must bow their knee before him. And those are just some of the ways that shows Joseph as a type of Jesus Christ. And we see those types, we see those shadows as we go through the Old Testament. They point to things that happen in the New Testament. And we look at, in each of these books, we have looked at Christ in the book. And there is no direct prophecy of Christ in Exodus. But there are many types. There's many portraits of Christ in Exodus. And here are a few. Of course, Moses, in dozens of ways, Moses is a type of Christ because Moses and Christ are both prophets, priests, and we're going to say kings. Now, Moses was not a king in the way that we think about king, but he was the leader of the nation of Israel. So we can say that they're both prophets, priests, and kings. Both are kinsman redeemers. Both are endangered in infancy. Both voluntarily renounce power and wealth. Both are deliverers, lawgivers, and mediators. When we look at the Passover in Exodus, in John 1:29, I think I have that here. John 1:29 says, of course, this is John talking in the New Testament when we talk about the Passover. John looked at Christ and said, the next day John saw Jesus coming to him, and he said, "Behold, the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world." Well, what was John referring to? He was referring to that lamb in the first Passover in Egypt. In verse 36, it also talks about that. And then in 1 Corinthians 5:7, it also talks about making it clear that Christ is our slain Passover lamb. And it says in 1 Corinthians 5:7, "Clean out the old leaven," or the old sin in your life, "so that you may be a new lump," or a new loaf of bread, "just as you are in fact unleavened," because you have no sin in your life now. For Christ, our Passover, also has been sacrificed. So John in the New Testament acknowledged Jesus Christ as being our Passover. And then we go on talking about our slain God and the Passover lamb. We also have the 7 feasts that appear in Exodus, and we're going to get on deeper into the 7 feasts when we get into Leviticus. But the 7 feasts each of those portrays some form of the ministry of Christ. In the Exodus in general, Paul relates baptism to the Exodus event because baptism symbolizes death to the old and identification with the new. And this is what Paul says about baptism. For I do not, that's in 1 Corinthians 10, 1 and 2. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea, and they all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They were baptized into Moses. We go under the water to be baptized. Basically, the nation of Israel went under the water when they went through the Red Sea. It identifies them with Moses, and we are identified as we are baptized in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So the baptism symbolizes death to the old and identification with the new. And when you look at the tabernacle, which God gives Moses the specific, very specific instructions on how to build the tabernacle in Exodus, there are many things, many, and I say many things in the tabernacle that point to the things that we learn about Jesus Christ. It shows the suffering, it shows the death, but then after the suffering and the death, it points to the beauty, the holiness, and the glory of God. And basically, the tabernacle is a study all in itself because it is theology basically in physical form when you get into it. We don't have time to do that here. But when you look at the tabernacle, and also when you look at the high priest of the tabernacle, in several ways, the high priest foreshadows the ministry of Christ, who is our great high priest. And that's in Hebrews 4:14 through 16. Let me see if I have that. Yeah. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let's hold firmly to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are. Jesus knows, personally knows, the things that we have gone through. Why? Because he has gone through them himself. But he was tempted in all things just as we are, but get this, yet without sin. And that's the key to the whole thing. That's why he is our great high priest. Therefore, verse 16 says, let's approach the throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace for help at our time of need. And of course, Jesus is our great high priest in that study of the tabernacle. Exodus's contribution to the Bible. This is a topic here, but we've already talked about basically the contribution to the Bible and how it all, basically most of the Old Testament is tied back to an understanding of Exodus. So Exodus accounts for many of the religious ceremonies and customs of Israel. And we're going into the rest of the Old Testament. We'll see those ceremonies. We'll see those customs. And basically Exodus is where they come from. Basically Exodus is where God laid them out for the people. The customs of Israel, the creation of the tabernacle, the formation of the priesthood, the Mosaic law, and the sacrificial system. So Exodus is foundational for following the history of Israel. Of course, we said at the beginning, the 5 books of the law tie in with those next 12 books of history, so that all this is history from there all the way through Malachi. It's all history, okay, of the nation of Israel. It shows how Israel escaped from Egypt, how they became the covenant people of God, that people that says, God said, if you will do this, the covenant, if you will do this, I will do this, and came to know his presence and his ways. Exodus stands at the heart of the Old Testament, of the greatest example of the saving acts of God before Christ. And of course, this is all pointing to Christ, as we said. Those types and those shadows all point to Jesus Christ. It provides the framework for the rest of the Old Testament message. The Passover, the Exodus, Moses, the law, and the tabernacle dominated the thought of Israel for centuries to come. So everything basically is tied back to what happened in the book of Exodus, in the creation, basically, of the nation of Israel. We have talked about some of this in this survey. I'm just going to hit some of the high points that we need to make sure that we remember. God heard the cries of the people in Israel when they had reached that number in Israel, and they cried out to God to over 2 million people. God quickly responds by redeeming them, as we said, with an outstretched arm and with those judgments that he placed upon Pharaoh. God faithfully fulfills his promise that was made to Abraham. Or what did he promise to Abraham? He said, I will make you a great nation, and I will give you a land. Okay, and he does those two things as we see right here and what he does with this nation that has been formed within the boundaries of Egypt. And so this book falls basically into two parts. The first part in chapters 1 through 18, which we have gone over very well. After 4 centuries of slavery, they cry that. I'm just going to mention a few things. You need to remember that after 4 centuries, after 400 years, you need to know that after 400 years, over 2 million people cry out to God. But Pharaoh hardens his heart, and some of the plagues, it says God hardens Pharaoh's heart, and some of them says Pharaoh hardens his heart. So Pharaoh basically said, I don't even know this God. Who is this God you call Yahweh? I don't even know him. You call him Jehovah. I don't even know him that I should let the people of Israel go. But he soon learns. In his hard-headedness, in his hard-heartedness, he soon learns who the God of Israel is through those 10 plagues. But as they leave Egypt, God guides the nation out, over 2 million people, by a pillar of fire and smoke, and saves them from Egypt's pursuing army through a miraculous crossing of the Red Sea. And in the wilderness, he protects and sustains them throughout their journeys. And we're going to talk more about the wilderness as we get into the survey. And then in chapters 19 through 40, the people have now experienced God's deliverance. Okay, they're feeling pretty good about it right now. They've experienced his guidance and his protection. And they feel like they are ready to be taught what God expects of them. The redeemed people must now be set apart to walk with God. And that is the process that they are beginning as they leave Egypt on their way to the Promised Land. And so the emphasis moves from the narration of what happened in the Exodus and the redemption and the Passover in chapters 1 through 18, and in chapters 19 through 40, on Mount Sinai, Moses receives God's civil, moral, and ceremonial laws, as well as the pattern for the tabernacle to be built in the wilderness. And God gives Moses specific, I mean down to the dot, of how he wants the people to perform worship, how he wants them to create the tabernacle, what he wants them to do. So after God gives them all of this, we will see that the people sin, while even Moses is on the mountain with God, but God judges the people. I'm going to go over here in just a minute what they do with the golden calf. Then after that, after the judgment, God kills 3,000 of them. The tabernacle is constructed and consecrated. And of course, it is a building of beauty in a barren land and reveals much about the person of God and the way of redemption. So that covers, I believe, the first 18 chapters pretty well. But those are crucial. Those are need-to-know things about what happened in the book of Exodus. But as we go on into the parts where God lays out what he wants the people to do, they have been delivered from Egypt. They have now passed through the Red Sea, the baptism, as Paul talks about, unto Moses, and that picture of baptism. And so then the people almost automatically, almost immediately become dissatisfied. And they start complaining. Well, there's no water here. People, in chapter 15, uh, start murmuring about Moses, saying, what shall we drink? Well, you brought us out here in the wilderness. You brought us out here, 2 million people. We don't have anything to drink. And so they complain about hunger. God gave them water to drink. But then they complain about being hungry. I mean, God provides food for them in the form of manna. And of course, we go on to that. And they complain because they said, we had plenty to eat when we were in Egypt. But now you brought us out here in this wilderness to die, I guess, because there's nothing out here to eat. God shows his power again by providing them manna. But again, he gives specific instructions about how they should take the manna, how they could hold it, how long they could hold it, how much they should gather, what days they should gather. God gives them specific instructions, as he does pretty much with everything, every instruction that he gives. It's very specific. And then God tells them how to gather the manna. They go on and complain about lack of water again. God gives them water from the rock. And it goes on in chapter 17, and it talks about after the people had complained, chapter 17, verse 4, it says, and Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, what shall I do unto this people? They are almost ready to stone me, to kill me, Lord. Here I am out here in the middle of the desert, and they are complaining. They have been delivered. You have delivered them from the land of Egypt. But now they're complaining. They're almost ready to kill me. And the Lord said to Moses, go before the people, take with you the elders of Israel, and take your rod, wherewith you smote the river, take it in your hand, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there upon the rock in Horeb, and there you shall smite, and there thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it that the people may drink. Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And so God provided them not only food, he provided them water in the middle of the desert, in the middle of the wilderness where they were going towards the promised land. Chapter 17 talks about the defeat of Amalek. And if you remember, Amalek was, let me see here, Amalek came against them and fought with Israel in Rephidim. Moses called Joshua and told him to choose out men that would fight. And verse 10, it says, Joseph did as Moses had said to him and fought with Amalek, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And it came to pass when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed. When he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone, put it under him, and he sat thereon, and Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And this is what God said to Moses. He said, Moses, I want you to write this down. I want you to write this for a memorial in the book and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua. And this is what he says. I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Remember that as we go on through this survey, because that will come up again about the Amalek and the Amalekites. And Moses built an altar there and called the name of it Jehovah Nissi. And it means the Lord is my banner. And for he said, the Lord has sworn that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. But at one point, God will wipe out the name of the Amalekites. He goes on in chapter 18 and talks about Moses being so overwhelmed with the government part, the judgment part, the judging part of the children of Israel. And Jethro, his father-in-law, came to him and told him, look, you're you're way too busy. You're killing yourself basically, taking all of these cases before you. You need to spread it around. You need to teach some men these laws that we're going by, and you need to teach them how to be judges. And so that's what Moses did. He said, you're basically wearing yourself out, judging all of these people. So Moses did that. He hearkened to the voice in chapter 18, verse 24, and it says, Moses hearkened to the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said. So, and at the end of that chapter, it says, Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went his way into his own land. And it sounds like Jethro here is going back to his own land, back into the land of Midian. But this brings us in chapter 19, Israel at Sinai and the giving of the law. And basically this is where God called Moses up onto the mountain, saying, tell the people of Israel, you have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bear you up on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself. And this is where the covenant is basically restated. And he says, God says, now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, then you shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. And so Moses told that to the people. Moses went up to the mountain. The people stood at the bottom of the mountain, at the foot of the mountain, and Moses told the people, I'm going up on the mountain, but you can't come. You can't. God has called me up on the mountain. And it says in verse 18 of chapter 19, and Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. And the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. And so the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai to meet with Moses, to give him the laws and the instructions for the people of Israel to follow. So this is where God gives Moses the 10 Commandments, and not only that, he gives them the laws for the other things that are going to take place there. He gives them moral laws and civil laws of the 10 Commandments, how they should. 10 Commandments basically show how they should deal with God, and they also show how they should deal with their fellow man. But he also gives them laws concerning servants, concerning personal injury, laws concerning theft, property damage, dishonesty, immorality, religious obligations, laws concerning the Sabbath and the feasts, laws relating to conquest. When they go into the land, they would be going in as a nation of conquest to take the land back. But God says, I'm giving you specific instructions for that as well. And the covenant is basically ratified in verse 24. And this is what it said. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments, and all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has said, we will do. Wow. What if everybody said that today? Now, as we go on, we find out that the Israelites didn't keep the words that they said, but they said, we will do it. So Moses wrote all the words of the Lord and rose up early in the morning. He built an altar upon the hill and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. He did a burnt offering. Moses put the blood upon the offering. And in the middle part of chapter 24, the Lord's glory is revealed. Moses rose up and administered Joshua and went up into the mount of God. And the glory of the Lord abode upon Mount Sinai. God was showing himself. God was showing himself as much as he could physically to the nation of Israel. He said, I'm the God that gave you these rules and these laws, and I want you to obey them. But Moses went up again into the midst of the cloud on top of the mountain, and Moses was in the mount 40 days and 40 nights. And so then, as the Lord gives Moses more instruction, he gives him instructions on the tabernacle. And God gives the nation of Israel very specific instructions on building the tabernacle and the laws that go with the tabernacle. So in chapter 25, God begins to lay out the materials for the tabernacle. These are the things that I want you to get together. These are the things that I want you to gather to build the tabernacle. And so he gives them, I'm not going to read all of them. You can go to chapter 25 and see all the materials there. God lays out what he wants the ark to look like. He talks about the ark and the mercy seat. And of course, we know the Ark of the Covenant has always been the I guess the pinnacle, you could say, of the temple, because that is where God showed himself. That's where God filled the temple. And that's where the high priest would go into the Ark of the Covenant and have the sins of the people forgiven once a year on the Day of Atonement. So God gives them specific instructions, measurements, materials, everything. He gave them specific instructions on how to build the Ark of the Covenant. He also gave them specific instructions on what to put inside the covenant. There were 3 items inside the covenant, Ark of the Covenant, and we'll talk about those later and how that came about. Each one of these items that God describes, or God gives the instructions to Moses, each one of them represents is a type or shadow, as we talked about, of Jesus Christ. So each one of them talks about the table for the bread. He gives them specific instructions for that. And like I said, each one of these is a study in itself. If you go back and look at them, look at the study of the tabernacle. Each one of these is a study in itself, and it points to things that are going to happen later on. He gives them instructions for the candlestick and how to make it, and how to have 6 branches on it, 3 on one side and 3 on the other. How to put each one of the candles on. He gives them specific instructions for the curtains of the tabernacle, the boards that are going to make up the tabernacle, for the veils, that are the things that are going to be hanging in the tabernacle. Of course, we know that there had to be a veil between the open part of the tabernacle and between there and the Holy of Holies. And the brass altar of the tabernacle, God gives them instructions for that. The outer court, God shall make up the court of the tabernacle for each side. He not only tells them what to do, but he gives them this side and that side and the other side and all 4 sides. He tells them exactly how he wants it to be built and how he wants it to be used. In chapter 27, he talks about the oil and how the oil should be used in the tabernacle. And of course, we know that oil is a symbol. It is a type of the Holy Spirit. And he talks about in chapter 28 the priest's garments, basically, in chapter 28, and how everything in their very specific instructions. He talks about how the priest will come from the tribe of Levi, and the tribe of Levi will be the one who take care of the tabernacle and who administer the rituals and the customs in the tabernacle. But he talks about also in chapter 29 the priest's consecration and how they should be cleansed, and how they would be the administrators of the tabernacle. That's very specific, and he goes on quite a bit there. How to sanctify the tabernacle, how to make an atonement for the altar, how everything that touches the tabernacle shall be holy and had to be cleansed and had to be pure and had to be without sin before it touched anything of the tabernacle. Talked about the altar of incense, and of course we know that represents prayers going up to the Lord, and how that represents our prayers going up to the Lord in this day and time. And God gives them very specific instructions about that. He talks about the money that was brought into the tabernacle, and how that each family would have to bring a half shekel into the tabernacle for their atonement, for their payment for their sin, and that priest would offer the prayers for their sacrifice and for their atonement for their sins, and how that money would be used, and how everybody in Israel would be required, and God gave special, specific instructions for that. The brass laver that was set out in front of the tabernacle, the anointing oil, the incense, God gave specific instructions for that. Not only that for the altar of incense, but for the incense that was going to be used on the altar of incense. He gave specific, very specific instructions for that. In chapter 33, he talks about the repentance of the people, and how the prayer of the priest and the repentance of the people was going to take place. And this is in chapter 33. The Lord said unto Moses, Depart and go up hence, and all the people with you, unto the land which I swear unto Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob, saying, Unto thy seed will I give it, and I will send an angel before thee. In other words, I will take care of you. I will take care of you. All the people that were there, he listed them all, and he said, I'm going to send you to a land flowing with milk and honey, for I will not go up in the midst of thee, for you are a stiff-necked people, lest I consume thee in the way. But he said, I'm going to send an angel with you that will protect you. He told Moses to tell the people, you are a stiff-necked people. In other words, you don't want to listen to what I'm telling you. You don't want to do what I'm telling you. You say with your mouth that you want to do what I want you to do, but you don't show it in your actions that you want to do what I'm telling you to do. And so it came to pass when Moses went out of the tabernacle to tell them what all God had told them, that the people rose up, and they stood every man at his tent door and looked after Moses until he was gone into the tabernacle. And it came to pass, as Moses entered the tabernacle, the cloudy pillar descended and stood at the door of the tabernacle, and the Lord talked with Moses. When Moses went into the tabernacle, there was a cloudy pillar that came and stood at the tabernacle. And that's how God talked to Moses. That's how God showed himself to be the leader of Israel through Moses. And Moses also, in chapter 33, Moses pleaded with the Lord, basically saying, Lord, I don't want you to destroy this people. He said there in verse 13, he said, Now therefore I pray you, if I have found grace in your sight, show me your way, that I may know you, that I may find grace in your sight. And consider that this nation is thy people. And Moses basically said, God told Moses, he said, My presence shall go with thee, and I will give you rest. And he said unto him, If thy presence go not with me, carry us not. In other words, God, if you're not going with us, don't even send us, because there's no reason for us to go if you're not going. This is after the people had sinned, and God told them they were a stiff-necked people. But in chapter 34, the covenant is renewed again, and the Lord came and descended in the cloud again, and he told Moses to go up unto the people, all the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. And he said, but take heed to yourself. In other words, be careful. Do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of those lands where you go, because it will be a snare for you in the midst of it. He said, but you shall destroy their altars, break their images, and cut down their groves. For you shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. And he said, unless you be careful, because you might make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they go after other gods and sacrifice their gods, and one call you, and you eat of his sacrifice. He says, if you go up into that land and you don't tear down all of the altars, all of the things, all the idols that are there, before long, you'll be making your sacrifices to those idols too. Wow, does that speak to us today in America and around the world? How false gods have taken the place of the one true God in our lives and in our nations. And even today, we have people in America who are wanting to do away with the Bible, wanting to do away with what God has told us to do and how God has told us to have a relationship with Him. God gave instructions in chapter 35, the construction of the tabernacle, and He goes on and gives them specific instructions there. How to put it together, he told them how to get all the material together, but then he tells them here how to put it all together, how to use the materials, how to make everything, all the furniture and everything that goes in to the temple. We talked about the high priest, and Aaron was going to be the high priest, and in 39 it talks about the garments that Aaron would need to be to be the high priest. And he talked about the holy garments for Aaron as the Lord commanded Moses, and the ephod that was a breastplate that went over the priest and had stones for each one of the 12 tribes of Israel, how it would be set. He made the breastplate, which was the ephod, of cunning work, like the work of the ephod, of gold, blue, purple, scarlet, and fine twined linen. It was 4 square. In other words, it was square. They talked about the four rows of stones, 3 rows in each 3 stones in each row to represent the 12 tribes of Israel that the high priest would wear on his breast, which would be close to the heart, close to the heart of the Lord and what God wanted the Lord to do for the nation of Israel. And so we begin to come to the end of Exodus. The tabernacle is erected as they get everything, all the materials together, as they get all the materials put together, as they get the priest sanctified, as they get the clothes and the garments and everything for the priest. The tabernacle is erected. And it goes through and talks about in chapter 40 where they put everything, how they did everything exactly like the Lord had told them to do. And this is what happened after they did exactly what the Lord had told them to do. In chapter 34 of verse 40, chapter 40, in verse 34 of chapter 40, it gives an example here of what happens when we do exactly what God tells us to do. And of course that is another type, another shadow of things that happen later on in the Bible. But in verse 34, it says, "Then a cloud covered the tent of the congregation, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter into the tent of the congregation because the cloud abode thereon, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." Moses couldn't even go inside because the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And when the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the children of Israel went onward in their journeys. When God would get ready for them to move, His glory, His cloud would leave over the tabernacle. Well, they would take the tabernacle down and they would move on to wherever God led them to do. But if the cloud were not taken up, then they journeyed not until the day it was taken up. In other words, while God was there dwelling in the tabernacle, and they knew God was dwelling in the tabernacle, they didn't move. They didn't go anywhere. They stayed right where they were because they knew that God wasn't ready for them to move. But it said, "For the cloud of the Lord was upon the tabernacle by day, and fire was on it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys." The presence of God was strong with the children of Israel as they made their journey. cloud was on the tabernacle by day, and a pillar of fire was fire was on it by night, the Bible said. The presence, the very presence, the glory of God was with the nation of Israel in the tabernacle as they began their journeys through the promised land. And we will get on into more of the law in the next session. I will see you then. God bless you.